My parents tried to force me to become my disabled sister's caregiver after I gave up my entire childhood for her. So I called Adult Protective Services for abandonment. I'm 25 and have been living on my own for 3 years in this ground floor flat that I worked my ass off to afford. Givers her whole life. And honestly, my entire childhood revolved around Hazel's needs. I never got birthday parties because Hazel couldn't handle the noise. Never did sports because my parents couldn't drive me to practice and watch Hazel at the same time. Never had friends over because Hazel needed quiet. Every family vacation was to the same handicap-accessible cabin 2 hours away because Hazel couldn't handle change. I moved out at 18 the second I could and got a job at a call center while going to night school. I worked 60-hour weeks to get my degree in graphic design and finally got a remote job that pays decently. I found this flat that's perfect for me, close to shops, has a little garden, everything I never had growing up. My parents visited maybe twice the whole time I've lived here. They only called when they needed me to watch Hazel so they could go to a doctor's appointment or grocery shopping. I always said yes, even though Hazel would scream the entire time and throw things at me because she didn't like change. 6 months ago, my dad started making comments about how my flat would be perfect for Hazel. It's all one level, wide doorways, accessible bathroom. He kept pointing out modifications I could make to accommodate her wheelchair better. I laughed it off, thinking he was just making conversation. Then my mom started asking about my work schedule, how flexible it was, whether I could work while caring for someone. I told her I was happy with my current situation and changed the subject. 2 months ago, they invited me for dinner and ambushed me. They'd already talked to Hazel's social worker about transferring her care to me. They'd looked into government assistance I could get as her caregiver. They'd even figured out how to modify my flat using some grant money. They presented this whole plan about how I'd take Hazel during the week and they'd take weekends. I said absolutely not. My mom started crying about how tired they were, how they'd given up everything for Hazel and now it was my turn to help. My dad said I was being selfish, living alone in a flat that could house Hazel when they were struggling. I reminded them that I'd already given up my entire childhood for Hazel. No dance classes, no sleepovers, no college visits, because everything was about Hazel. They said that was different. I was a child then and didn't understand sacrifice. Now I was an adult and needed to step up. I left and didn't speak to them for 2 weeks. Then they started their campaign. They told every relative that I was abandoning my disabled sister. My aunt called me crying about how could I let Hazel suffer. My grandma said she was disappointed in me. My cousins posted about ableism and family responsibility on Facebook, clearly aimed at me. My parents started bringing Hazel to my flat uninvited, leaving her at my door saying they had emergencies. The first time I let them in and watched her for 6 hours while they disappeared. The second time, I called Adult Protective Services and reported abandonment. My parents had to rush back and deal with a social worker. They were furious but couldn't say much with the social worker there. Then they tried guilt. They had Hazel call me crying, saying she missed me and wanted to live with me. I knew they coached her because Hazel never expressed complex thoughts like that. They sent me photos of Hazel looking sad with captions about how she needed her sister. They even made a scrapbook of us as kids to show our bond, ignoring that in every photo I looked miserable while Hazel got all the attention. The last straw was when they called my employer, told my boss I was needed for a family medical emergency and might need to take extended leave to care for my disabled sister. My boss was understanding but concerned about my ability to maintain my workload. I had to explain everything and promise it wouldn't affect my job. That's when I decided to end this permanently. I spent the whole weekend sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, searching through lawyer websites and reading reviews until my eyes hurt. I typed in things like family harassment lawyer and forced caregiving legal help and scrolled through dozens of results. Most of the lawyers had these fancy websites with stock photos of people shaking hands, but I needed someone who actually understood what my parents were doing. Around evening, I found Meredith Thorne's site. Her bio said she specialized in boundary violations and family coercion, which sounded exactly right. She had articles about adult children being pressured into caregiving roles they never agreed to, and I felt like she was describing my exact situation. I filled out her contact form right there, typing out the basics about my parents showing up uninvited and calling my boss. She had an opening Monday morning at 9, so I booked it and spent the rest of the weekend trying not to think about how much this was going to cost. Monday morning, I logged into the video call 5 minutes early, sitting in my home office with a notebook full of dates and details I'd written down. Meredith appeared on screen right at 9 o'clock. She looked maybe 40, with short dark hair and these sharp eyes that made me feel like she was already analyzing everything. I started explaining the situation, trying to keep my voice steady, but within the first 2 minutes, she stopped me. She said what my parents were doing wasn't just annoying or pushy, it was financial and emotional abuse. The word abuse hit me hard because I'd been thinking of it as just family drama, but she explained that their campaign to force me into caregiving had actual legal implications. She asked about the call to my employer, and I showed her the email my boss had sent after my parents contacted him. Meredith leaned forward and said that was workplace interference and we could use it. We spent the next hour going through everything systematically. She had me pull up my phone to show her the guilt trip texts, the photos of Hazel they'd sent, the Facebook posts from relatives. She made notes about the 2 times they'd shown up at my flat, and especially the second time when I'd called Adult Protective Services. She asked if I had the police report from that incident, and I told her the officer had given me a case number. She said to get a copy of that report immediately because documentation was everything. By the end of the call, I had a list of things to gather, including a timeline of every incident since the dinner ambush 2 months ago, and I felt like someone finally believed this wasn't just me being dramatic. Tuesday evening, I was working on a design project when my doorbell rang. I looked at my phone and saw it was almost 7. The bell rang again, then someone knocked hard. I got up and looked through the peephole. My dad's car was parked right outside my building with Hazel visible in the passenger seat. My mom was at my door, knocking harder now. I stepped back from the door and my heart started racing. They'd done this before, but this time I wasn't opening it. My mom started yelling through the door about how I needed to help them, how they had an emergency and needed me to watch Hazel for just a few hours. My dad joined her, his voice louder, saying I was being selfish and childish. I grabbed my phone and called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher asked what was happening, and I explained my parents were at my door, refusing to leave after I'd asked them not to come here. She said an officer would come by. My parents kept knocking and yelling for another 10 minutes. My dad said I was living in a flat that could house Hazel while they struggled. My mom said I'd understand when I was older and had my own family responsibilities. Then they must have heard the sirens because suddenly it got quiet and I heard their car door slam. By the time the officer knocked on my door, my parents had driven off. The officer was this young guy who looked maybe 25. He took down my information and asked what had happened. I explained about the ongoing harassment and showed him the texts and emails. He wrote everything down and gave me a report number. He said if they came back, I should call immediately. After he left, I texted Meredith the report number, and she responded within minutes, saying this was exactly the kind of documentation we needed. Wednesday afternoon, I was in the middle of a client call when my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from a number I didn't recognize. I finished the call and listened to the message. It was my dad's voice, but calling from someone else's phone. He said they'd tried to be reasonable, but I'd left them no choice. He said they were cutting me out of their will unless I stepped up for family like I should have years ago. He went on about how disappointed they were and how I'd regret this when they were gone and I had nothing. His voice had this cold edge I'd never heard before. I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Meredith with a message asking if this mattered. She called me back within an hour. She said this was financial manipulation and it strengthened my case significantly because it showed a pattern of using money and guilt to control me. She asked if I expected to inherit anything substantial, and I said probably not much, maybe $20,000 if that. She said it didn't matter what the amount was. What mattered was them using it as a weapon. She told me to save every voicemail like this and not to respond to any of their attempts to contact me. Hanging up the phone, I felt this weird mix of relief that the voicemail helped my case and hurt that my dad had actually said those things out loud. Thursday morning, I woke up to an email from Everett, my boss at the design company. The subject line said, "Private conversation needed," and my stomach dropped. He asked if I could do a video call at 10. I spent the next hour getting ready and trying not to panic. At 10, I logged in and Everett was there looking concerned. He said my parents had called again yesterday asking about my work schedule and whether the company offered family leave. He said he told them he couldn't discuss employee matters with family members, but he needed to know what was going on because this was affecting my professional reputation. I felt my eyes start to sting and I had to take a breath before explaining. I told him about my parents trying to force me into becoming Hazel's caregiver, about the harassment, about the lawyer I'd hired. I pulled up the police report on my screen and showed him Meredith's contact information to prove I was handling this professionally. Everett listened and his expression softened. He said he believed me and supported me, but he was worried about whether this would affect my ability to focus on my projects. I promised him it wouldn't and said I was taking legal steps to stop the harassment permanently. He said okay and told me to keep him updated if my parents contacted the company again. After the call ended, I sat there feeling shaky because I'd almost cried in front of my boss and because my parents were now actively trying to mess with my career. Friday night around 8, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Paige, my mom's sister. She started right in with how she'd been at some family gathering and heard about what was happening. She said she couldn't believe I was abandoning Hazel when my parents had given up everything for her. She said the family was talking about how selfish I was being, and she wanted to hear my side, but honestly, she didn't see how I could justify this. I felt this familiar guilt start to rise up, but then I remembered what Meredith had said about not engaging. I took a breath and calmly explained the actual timeline. I told her about my childhood with no birthday parties or friends, about my parents ambushing me with their care plan, about them showing up uninvited and leaving Hazel at my door. I mentioned the Adult Protective Services calls and the police report from Tuesday. Paige went quiet for a long moment. Then she said she needed to think about some things. She said she remembered some stuff from when I was growing up that she hadn't really thought about at the time. She asked if she could call me back in a few days, and I said yes. After we hung up, I felt this tiny spark of hope that maybe one family member might actually understand my side. The following Monday, I met Meredith at her office to file the cease and desist letter. Her office was in this older building downtown with wood paneling and bookshelves full of legal books. We sat at her conference table and she showed me the letter she'd drafted. It was 2 pages long and listed every incident of harassment, including the uninvited visits, the workplace contact, the social media campaign, and the financial threats. The letter demanded my parents stop contacting me, stop contacting my employer, and stop showing up at my residence. It outlined potential legal action, including restraining orders if the harassment continued. Reading it made everything feel suddenly very real and very serious. Meredith asked if I wanted to make any changes, and I said no. It covered everything. She said she'd send it certified mail so we'd have proof they received it. I signed the authorization form and wrote a check for her retainer. Watching my savings account take a hit hurt, but felt necessary. Walking out of her office, I felt powerful and scared at the same time, because I was officially escalating this to a legal level, and there was no going back from here. My parents' response came faster than I expected. Wednesday afternoon, my cousin Kendra sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post my mom had made. The post said their ungrateful daughter had hired a lawyer to abandon her disabled sister. It said they'd given up everything to care for Hazel, and now their other daughter was throwing them away. It said they were heartbroken and didn't understand how they'd raised someone so selfish. The post had dozens of comments already. Relatives and family friends were calling me heartless and saying I should be ashamed. My grandmother commented that she was praying for my soul. People who barely knew me were sharing the post and adding their own thoughts about how terrible I was. I wanted to respond so badly, to tell everyone the actual truth, but I remembered Meredith saying engaging would only make things worse. I called her instead and read her the post. She said to screenshot everything and save it, because this was defamation and harassment. She said my parents were trying to force me into responding publicly, but I needed to stay silent. She said we'd use all of this when we filed for the restraining order. I spent the rest of the day blocking family members on social media and trying to focus on work while my phone kept buzzing with notifications. Wednesday morning, I got a call from a number with a government area code. It was Silas Vance, the social worker from Adult Protective Services. He said he was following up on both reports I'd filed about my parents abandoning Hazel at my door. He asked if I had time to answer some detailed questions, and I said yes. He started asking about my childhood, about how much time I'd spent caring for Hazel, about whether I'd had normal kid experiences. I told him about the no birthday parties, no sports, no friends over, because everything revolved around Hazel's needs. I told him about never going to college visits because my parents couldn't leave Hazel. He asked about my parents' current behavior, and I described the dinner ambush, the social media campaign, the workplace interference, everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a second. Then he said what I'd experienced was called parentification. I'd never heard that word before. He explained it meant my parents had made me take on adult caregiving responsibilities as a child when I should have been allowed to be a kid. He said it was a form of abuse, and it explained a lot about why I was so resistant to their current demands. I sat there holding my phone and feeling like someone had finally put a name to something I'd felt my whole life but never understood. Silas said he was going to schedule a home visit with my parents to assess Hazel's current care situation. He said he'd call me after the visit to update me. After we hung up, I immediately Googled parentification and spent an hour reading articles that described my entire childhood. Silas called me back Friday afternoon after his visit with my parents. He said Hazel's physical care was fine and my parents had adequate resources and support systems to continue caring for her. But then he said something that made me furious. He said during the visit, my parents had been telling Hazel that I didn't love her anymore. They'd apparently been saying I'd moved away and forgotten about her, that I didn't want to be her sister anymore. Silas said Hazel had seemed confused and sad when he asked about me. He said my parents were using Hazel's emotions to manipulate me, which was harmful to Hazel and completely inappropriate. He said he was documenting this in his report and recommending my parents get counseling about appropriate boundaries. I thanked him for telling me and hung up. Then I sat there shaking with anger because my parents weren't just harassing me anymore. They were messing with Hazel's head to punish me. Hazel didn't understand what was really happening, and they were making her think I'd abandoned her. I texted Meredith about what Silas had said, and she responded that this was another piece of evidence showing my parents' manipulative behavior. She said we had a strong case now and asked if I was ready to file for a restraining order. I typed back yes without hesitating. I started documenting everything that weekend. Every Facebook post my parents made got a screenshot with the timestamp visible. Every comment from relatives telling me I was heartless got saved. Every nasty message from strangers who somehow found my personal accounts went into a folder on my laptop. I made a timeline starting from that dinner 2.5 months ago where they ambushed me with their whole plan. I wrote down dates and times for every uninvited visit, every call from family members pressuring me, every incident where they tried to manipulate me into taking Hazel. The police report from when they abandoned her at my door went into the folder. The voicemail about cutting me out of their will got saved in 3 different places. By Sunday night, I had a document that was 20 pages long, showing exactly how my parents had been harassing me since I said no to their demands. Meredith called Monday morning to check in, and I told her I'd finished the documentation. She asked me to email everything over so she could review it before we filed for a restraining order. I spent an hour organizing all the files and sent them through. She called back 2 hours later and said the evidence was solid. She said the social media posts alone showed a pattern of harassment and defamation, and adding in the workplace interference and physical intrusions at my flat made a strong case. We scheduled an appointment for Thursday to file the paperwork. My phone rang Friday afternoon while I was trying to focus on a logo design for a client. It was Paige. I almost didn't answer because I figured she was calling to yell at me again about abandoning Hazel. But something made me pick up. She started talking before I could say anything. She said she'd been thinking about our last conversation all week. She said she'd called Silas to ask some questions about his assessment and what he'd found during his home visit. He'd told her about the parentification issue and how my parents had been telling Hazel I didn't love her anymore. Paige went quiet for a second, and then she said she was sorry. She said she'd been at my house plenty of times when I was a kid, and she remembered now how I never got to do anything normal, how every family gathering revolved around Hazel's needs, and nobody ever asked what I wanted. She said the whole family had enabled my parents' expectation that I'd sacrifice my life for Hazel just like they did, and she hadn't realized how wrong that was until Silas explained it to her. Then she said something that made me start crying. She said if I needed a character witness for any legal stuff, she'd do it. She said she'd tell the truth about what my childhood was really like. I thanked her about 5 times and hung up, feeling like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this. Tuesday evening the following week, my doorbell rang. I checked the peephole and saw my dad standing there by himself. He looked terrible. His clothes were wrinkled and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. I opened the door but kept the chain lock on. He asked if he could come in and talk. I said no, but I'd listen from where I was. He said my mom was having health problems from the stress of caring for Hazel. He said they didn't need me to take over completely, they just needed some help. He looked so defeated standing there that I almost felt bad. I told him there were professional care options and respite services that could give them breaks without putting everything on me. His whole face changed. He got angry and said I was trying to throw Hazel away like garbage. He said they'd raised me better than to abandon family when things got hard. I told him I'd already given up my entire childhood and I wasn't doing it again. I shut the door while he was still talking. Thursday morning, I had my first appointment with Liana Shaw. Her office was in this old house that had been converted into a therapy practice. She had me fill out some paperwork about what brought me in, and then we talked for almost an hour. I told her about Hazel and my parents and the constant pressure and how I couldn't sleep anymore, how I kept checking my phone expecting another nasty message or another relative calling to guilt trip me. She asked about my childhood, and I told her the same things I'd told Silas. No birthday parties, no sports, no friends, everything about Hazel. Liana said something that stuck with me. She said, your guilt about Hazel wasn't rational because you were a child who had no choice in any of it. She said, your parents are repeating the same pattern now, trying to sacrifice one daughter's well-being for the other. She said, the fact that you feel guilty about protecting yourself shows how deeply they've conditioned you to put Hazel first no matter what. We scheduled weekly appointments, and I left feeling like maybe therapy could actually help. Silas called the following Monday with news that completely shocked me. He said during his assessment, he'd asked Hazel directly what she wanted, not what my parents wanted for her, but what Hazel herself wanted, and Hazel had told him she was interested in living with other people her age in a group home setting. She'd apparently been watching TV shows about people with disabilities living independently, and she wanted to try it. Silas said my parents had never asked Hazel what she wanted, they'd just assumed she'd be scared of change and need to stay with them forever. But Hazel had told him she was tired of being at home all the time and wanted to meet new people. I sat there holding my phone and feeling this weird mix of relief and anger. Relief that Hazel actually wanted something different, anger that my parents had never bothered to ask her and had just assumed I'd take over their role without question. My parents found out about Hazel's conversation with Silas by Wednesday. I know because they went completely insane on social media. My mom posted this long thing about how I'd poisoned their daughter against them, how I'd manipulated a social worker to steal Hazel away and destroy their family. The post included my full name and the name of my graphic design company. By Wednesday afternoon, I was getting messages from complete strangers. People I'd never met were telling me I should be ashamed of myself, that I was a terrible person for abandoning my disabled sister, that I deserved whatever bad things happened to me. My anxiety went through the roof. I couldn't focus on work. I kept checking my phone every 5 minutes to see if there were new messages or comments. I called Meredith in a panic, and she told me to screenshot everything and add it to the documentation. She said this social media campaign was harassment and defamation, and it made our case for a restraining order even stronger.
Tuesday morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was the security guard from the building where my company's main office is located. He said 2 people were in the lobby demanding to speak with me and claiming to be my parents. He said they'd found the company address online and drove over, even though he'd explained I worked remotely from home. He asked if I wanted him to let them up. I said absolutely not and asked him to tell them to leave. He said they were refusing and getting loud with him. I had to call the building manager and explain that my parents were harassing me and I'd be filing a restraining order. The manager was professional about it, but I felt so embarrassed, like I was bringing all this family drama into professional spaces and making it everyone else's problem. The security guard called back 20 minutes later to say my parents had finally left after the manager threatened to call the police. Thursday afternoon, I met Meredith at the courthouse to file for a restraining order. I brought a folder that was almost 3 inches thick. Screenshots of every social media post and message, the police report from when they abandoned Hazel at my door, documentation of them calling my employer, a written statement from Paige about my childhood, a letter from Silas detailing his findings about parentification and Hazel's expressed wishes. The court clerk processed all the paperwork, and Meredith submitted everything to the judge. We waited for 2 hours before getting called into a small office. The judge looked through the evidence and asked me a few questions about the harassment. Then she granted a temporary restraining order and scheduled a full hearing for 2 weeks out. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt this strange mix of grief and relief. I was legally separating myself from my parents. Part of me felt like I should be sad about that, but mostly I just felt relieved that maybe the harassment would finally stop. The restraining order hearing happened on a cold morning in early December. I showed up with Meredith and all our evidence organized in binders. My parents were already there with their own lawyer, some guy in an expensive suit who kept looking at me like I was the worst person in the world. Their lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive, said I was trying to punish my parents for asking for help with my disabled sister, that I was using the legal system to avoid family responsibility. But then the judge started reviewing the evidence. She read through Silas's testimony about parentification and how I'd been forced into a caregiver role as a child. She looked at the screenshots of my parents posting my personal information online and encouraging strangers to harass me. She reviewed the documentation of them showing up at my workplace and calling my employer.
Then she asked about Hazel's expressed wishes and Silas's recommendation for group home placement. When she finished reviewing everything, she looked at my parents and said their behavior had been inappropriate and controlling. She said they had no right to force their daughter into a caregiver role or to harass her when she set boundaries. She granted a permanent restraining order right there. My parents weren't allowed to contact me, come to my home, or come to my workplace. They had to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to the judge validate everything I'd been feeling my whole life, made me want to cry with relief. Silas called me the next week with updates about Hazel's transition. He said he was working with my parents and a group home placement specialist to find the right facility. Hazel had visited 3 different places and really loved one that had younger residents and lots of activities. She was nervous but excited about the change. Silas said she'd been attending orientation sessions and talking about having a roommate for the first time in her life. He said Hazel asked about me during one session, and he'd explained that I cared about her but needed some space from our parents right now. Hearing that Hazel was actually happy about this move made me feel good and sad at the same time. Good because she was finally getting opportunities to be independent and make friends. Sad because she should have had these chances years ago, instead of being kept at home because my parents assumed she couldn't handle change.
Hazel moved into the group home 2 days after Christmas, and I kept seeing Liana every week through January because the whole situation left me feeling weird and mixed up. Some days I felt relieved that the harassment finally stopped, and I could go back to my normal life without checking my phone every 5 minutes for angry messages. Other days, I felt guilty, like maybe I should have tried harder to help my parents or found some middle ground that didn't end with a restraining order. Liana kept reminding me that the guilt wasn't based on anything real. She explained that my parents had trained me from childhood to feel responsible for Hazel's happiness and their stress, and just because that training was deep didn't make it true or fair. She walked me through all the times I'd tried to set boundaries or suggest alternatives, and my parents had shut me down or manipulated me into backing off. During one session in mid-January, I told her I kept thinking about all the years I spent taking care of Hazel as a kid and wondering if I was a bad person for not wanting to do it again as an adult. Liana looked at me and said I was never supposed to be Hazel's caregiver in the first place, that children shouldn't raise their siblings, and choosing not to repeat an unfair pattern didn't make me selfish or cruel. She helped me understand that my parents had their own problems with control and martyrdom that had nothing to do with me, and protecting myself from their dysfunction was healthy, even when other people said I was wrong. Paige called me in late January and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee at this place near my flat. I was nervous because even though she'd apologized before, part of me worried she might try to guilt trip me again about the family situation. But when I got there, she ordered us both drinks and immediately started talking about my mom's childhood in this quiet, serious way. She told me that my grandmother was exactly like my mom, always creating some crisis or emergency that made her the center of attention and made everyone else responsible for fixing her problems. Paige said, "When your mom was growing up, my grandmother would get sick or upset any time someone tried to do something independent, and the whole family had to drop everything to take care of her emotional needs." She explained that my mom learned to get importance and control by being the person who sacrificed everything, and now she was doing the same thing by making Hazel's care into this impossible burden that defined her whole identity. Paige said this didn't excuse how my parents treated me or make their behavior okay, but it helped her understand why they couldn't see how unfair they were being. She said, "Your mom genuinely believes that suffering for your family is the only way to prove you love them, and she can't understand why you don't want that same life." Hearing about the generational pattern made me feel sad for my mom in a way I hadn't before, like she was trapped in a cycle she didn't even recognize.
But it also made me more sure that I'd done the right thing by breaking away because I didn't want to pass that same dysfunction down to anyone else. Silas called me in early February and said he'd arranged for me to visit Hazel at the group home if I wanted to see how she was settling in. I was nervous driving over there because I didn't know what to expect or if Hazel would be angry at me for not taking her in like our parents wanted. But when I walked into the common room, Hazel was sitting with another woman around her age watching TV, and she lit up when she saw me. She wheeled over and started talking fast about her roommate and the art class she'd joined, and the staff member who helped her learn to make her own breakfast choices. She took me to her room and showed me how she decorated it with posters and photos, pointing out everything she'd picked herself without anyone telling her what to use. She introduced me to 2 different staff members and told them I was her sister in this proud way that made my chest feel tight. We sat in the common area for almost an hour and had an actual conversation about her life, what activities she liked, which residents she was becoming friends with, what foods she wanted to try. It felt completely different from all those years of me just managing her needs and trying to keep her calm. For the first time, we were talking like 2 real people instead of caregiver and patient, and I realized I'd never actually known Hazel as a person before this moment. By early March, I'd fallen into a new routine where I saw Hazel every other week at the group home and had coffee with Paige once a month to catch up. My parents were completely out of my life because of the restraining order, and honestly, most days I didn't think about them at all. I still had sessions with Liana every 2 weeks because some days the guilt would hit me hard, usually triggered by something random like seeing a family at the grocery store or hearing a song that reminded me of childhood. On those days, I'd feel sad about the family rupture and wonder if there was some other way I could have handled everything. But Leona kept walking me through the same facts, reminding me that I'd tried boundaries and suggestions and compromise, and my parents had responded with harassment and manipulation every single time. She helped me remember that I'd worked incredibly hard to build an independent life, and I deserved to keep it without sacrificing myself again. Hazel was genuinely happy in the group home with choices and community and staff who treated her like a capable adult instead of a permanent child. I could never have given her that kind of life, even if I'd let my parents move her into my flat and spend every day managing her care. The restraining order meant I finally had peace and safety in my own home.